Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by Cody and Tracy on the mic today, Karen and Matt in the studio. Tracy, what is our topic today?
Today, our topic is responsive versus disruptive leadership.
That's right. But before we get into the topic itself, Matt, you have an announcement, I think.
Yeah. So a couple episodes ago, we did What Each Genius Craves, and we wanted to make an edit to What Galvanizers Crave. So before we had confirmation, and we received feedback from a couple listeners, a couple Working Genius certified facilitators. Shout out Andrew Spade, Carolyn Strauss, Dale McIntyre, and a couple others. But we thought engagement was more fitting for What Galvanizers Crave, because it doesn't need to be affirming what they are trying to get everybody on board with. It just needs to be acknowledging and responding to it.
Cody, you're a galvanizer.
I just had a phone call earlier today where I wish this person would have actually argued with me. It would have been far better than the nonverbal nothing that I got. So engagement is probably it, because I don't need her to say, yes, let's do it. I would just as likely have had her say, I disagree, that's a bad idea. And I'd be like, okay, let's do that. Let's go down that road. So I like engagement because it doesn't have to be, confirmation was a little bit off. So that's great. I love that we had people email in and felt similarly.
Yeah, it's great that they all had the same ideas too. I mean, there must be some accuracy there. All right, thanks, Matt. Very good. Okay, we're going to talk about leadership and the difference between responsive and disruptive. And, my initial thought to this is that we often assume leaders are disruptive. And remember, disruptive is innovation. I mean, it's invention, galvanizing, and tenacity. And people think, yeah, leaders do that. And that's very dangerous, because to be a great leader, you can be any working genius type or pairing. But we do need to understand what kind of situations and what kind of organizations might actually require more responsive or disruptive leadership, so that we can better understand how to adjust our styles or how to get other people involved. And I think this is really important, because I believe that anyone can be a great leader if they understand themselves and their situation.
Yeah, we do get that question about what is the right type for a leader. And you're totally right to say up front that we have met leaders. I mean, you just came home from a really large organization whose CEO is an enablement tenacity genius, and so there really are leaders of all different letter combinations. But and even as you described, like there might be businesses, or there might even be seasons where there's more disruptive that's required or more responsive that's required. So there's that level of self-awareness, but it's also the awareness of why. I mean, what I think is really sort of unique and beautiful about the model is that there's responsive and disruptive geniuses in each of the 3 phases of work. And so, of course, as a leader, you're going to have to lean on some of those in certain seasons and others in different seasons. So it'll be fun to chat about, like, what does that look like from a personality standpoint?
Yeah. Let's start here. What kind of companies or organizations might be classically more inclined toward disruptive versus, let's start with disruptive. So what kind of organizations, it might be easier if the leader was disruptive. And the first one I'll go is with maybe a startup.
Oh, you stole mine.
Oh, tell us why a startup would have a disruptive leader, Tracy.
Well, I mean, they're getting stuff off the ground. They're getting things started, and you really need to sort of shake things up and move quickly, I would say, at a startup. So I'm sure they would benefit from a leader pushing and disrupting.
Right, because the industry needs to change. Usually, that's what a startup is doing, and they're making something out of nothing. So you just naturally think about a lot of invention and galvanizing, for instance, just to get things going. What are some other industries or other kinds of companies that might be typical for a disruptive leader?
Yeah, it's so interesting. Even the question is why we're having this conversation is like, I don't know that it's always, because I love the answer startup, but at the same time, if there was a person whose geniuses were wonder and discernment, they probably also could help get a startup off the ground, but they would do it in a wildly different way, and they'd need to build a team around them that would help the disruptive side of that. And so it does feel less like industry specific as we're having this conversation and more situational.
Yeah, and that's why I say we're making a generalization here. I think it's just kind of fun to put it out there. I think about somebody like a land developer. In other words, we bought 100 acres and we're going to build homes and a strip mall and whatever else. Hopefully not a strip mall, but whatever else it is. And they have to like, oh gosh, we got to plow through and get over obstacles and get this done and rally all these people. And there's going to be some pushback. So one might think that seems like a more of a disruptive thing. I think of like trial attorneys. You don't go into the courtroom in a trial and try to just go with the flow. You got to force your will upon the people there and get things done. Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a generalization, and which can be dangerous, but I think it's interesting to start there. What's a generalization about what a responsive leader, what kind of organizations might be better suited to a responsive?
I might say education.
In many cases, like, okay, we've got a building, we've got kids coming in, we know what the calendar year is going to be. We've got a curriculum set here. It's less about breaking a mold.
Yep.
And more leading within the lanes.
Right. Or maybe like some sort of service industry that would work too, like a restaurant service potentially, or even like if you're providing services for children, for example, like you're kind of responding more to what's happening in the environment than you are pioneering something new or creating momentum that doesn't exist there.
Yeah, I would agree. I think of like you're running a hotel or something and it's pretty much set and everybody kind of knows what the offerings are. It could even be an established church, like at a traditional church where they've been doing things the same way for years and years. And it might very well be, hey, being disruptive might not necessarily seem like the best thing to do in that environment. Now, having established these generalizations, what would be the example of a church that might require some disruptive leadership?
I bet a lot of churches experienced this through the pandemic, which was, hey, we have to change the status quo. We can't just like open on Sundays every Sunday now. We need to actually figure out a way to innovate and change what has been what they do every Sunday and Wednesday for the last decade. So I bet in that season, it required a little bit more, some invention, some galvanizing and tenacity to disrupt the status quo.
Imagine being a missionary church in a foreign land where nobody around, you're putting a church there for the first time. Pretty sure that's disruptive.
Yeah.
I think about other organizations that might typically, like a school going through a crisis, or again, planting a new school or adding on to the school or doing something to deal with a change in the environment. I think the point here is even industries that look like they should be disruptive or responsive aren't necessarily what they might seem from the outside.
So what you're saying, Pat, is it's really less about the type of organization and more about the time or the season.
Yeah, what's going on? Are you breaking molds, or are you kind of keeping the trains running on time?
That's right.
Now, Cody makes a good point. I love, Cody, how you've always said, the best kind of leader is the self-aware one. So let's just say I am running a startup and somehow I came up with a great idea and I'm a WD. The question is, how do I surround myself with people that, even if it is a very disruptive environment we have to be in, that other people are kind of taking the lead on that?
I like this idea of identifying, are we in a season that is going to require a little more disruption? And am I wired to do that? And if not, boy, we better find somebody on the team or some way of helping manufacture that, because it's required during the season. And I do think that self-awareness is the critical piece of that is, hey, I'm probably not wired for exactly in a way that would contribute this way. I was thinking about this concept and how part of what's unique about this is when you introduce like the idea of invention, you use this caveated phrase of like, this is what people tend to think is genius, like this is the one that they identify as, oh, they're coming up with new ideas. And I feel like part of the conversation we're having right now is deconstructing what people think is a leader, because a lot of people probably are listening to this and going like, no, the leaders are the ones that are out there pioneering a new idea or galvanizing people to move in the startup. And the answer is that's actually not necessarily true. It depends on what's required. And I think of like I was thinking of, actually, I told this story about Alan Mulally recently, Pat, where you're an invention and discernment genius, but you'll get on stage and a lot of your leadership style has a little bit of galvanizing to it, and that's
Right.
burned you out over a certain time. And Alan, he is just as effective in getting people to do things. I don't think he's a galvanizer at all. He kind of actually sits back and he almost like whispers when you're talking to him. And you pay attention for a different reason. It's not because somebody's like pushing you. It's sort of like he's probably using wonder and discernment and real, and you're kind of leaning in. So like what you said is you might be a WD start doing a startup, and the contribution you can make can be different depending on your level of self-awareness, what's needed, and then the people around you.
Right. Now, yeah, and I don't know what we have to ask him, find out what his working genius is. Because imagine if you got called in to turn a company around and they said, okay, there's a lot of inertia around the wrong way to do things. We need to change this. Probably there's some people that would say, I'm double responsive. I don't know that I'm going to enjoy this.
Mm-hmm.
Or imagine that you turned around a company successfully and then you left and somebody hired you to run a bigger company, but your job was to come in and just shepherd that company along and it was on the right path and you weren't supposed to disrupt it. If you're a disruptive person, that might be a good job to pass up.
Right.
I think about Steve Jobs, who I actually had the chance to interview with years ago when he was at Pixar. In fact, the day before he got named to go back to Apple, I interviewed with him to run HR at Pixar. And I turned him down, and the recruiter said he's going to come by and find you tomorrow because you don't turn him down. But the next day, Apple actually hired him back because they went back to a disruptive environment. Their company was struggling, and the board said, we need somebody to come here and shake things up and build the next future for Apple. And so him, who I think is a very disruptive leader, became very appropriate for that time. But when it was just about maintaining the status quo or growing it incrementally, I can see that he was probably very frustrated at Apple.
Well, and you're totally right. Part of it is knowing who you are, because if you're the disruptive leader, if you're an inventor galvanizer, for example, and you're in a season of your company where it doesn't require a ton of pushing and lifting and changing, then it's very likely that, because we show up as our geniuses all the time, so you might be a leader in that organization that constantly is trying to disrupt when the organization is like, hey, this is not the time for that. Or the other people on the leadership team are like, no, this is not the time for new innovation. This is like, we're running the plan.
Yes. And granted, somebody could say, okay, I need to lead out of character for a while or out of my genius. But as we all know, having to do that for too long is a good recipe for burnout. I think about and I'm sorry to use this, I think about professional sports, like all these coaches, because they hire them and fire them so fast. And I'm pretty sure they don't do their working genius, because I think it would really help if they actually said, okay, you're going to come in and take over a team. It's been around for 80 years. We haven't won a game in years. You're going to have to completely rebuild the culture. And there are some coaches that would be like, this will be so much fun for me. And there are other coaches that would be, oh my, this is going to be misery. But I wonder how many coaches are willing to turn down that job, or how many teams are willing to not offer this famous coach a job because they realize they're not really suited in terms of their genius for the level of disruption or responsiveness. Now I'm going to talk about old football right now. So I'm a 49er fan, and Bill Walsh was like one of the best coaches ever. And he invented a new offense and he turned the 49ers around. They went from being horrible to being great. And he, I think, was very much of an inventor and a thinker and a tenacious person. I'd be surprised if he were in IT. Well, then when he retired, their team was still awesome. And they would go on to win, I think, 2 more Super Bowls. But they hired this guy named George Seifert, who I'm almost certain was completely responsive. So he came in and really maintained things and listened well and just responded and kept the trains on the tracks. And I think you can look back in history and see companies and organizations that got this right, even accidentally. And I think that people can probably be pretty intentional now about thinking what kind of leader they're getting and what they're best at. Does that make sense?
Yeah. And honestly, I think that's really good advice for someone who's thinking about a new job, because like there's 32 of those coaches in the NFL, and it kind of feels like, well, if I get offered this job, then I might as well take it. But if you're self-aware enough and you know what the season is, and it might be misery and failure for you if you're not aware of that.
Yeah. I wonder the guy, I don't remember, I can't remember his name. I think it was Mike, it was something Fields. I can't remember his first name, Mark Fields maybe, who took over after Allen at Ford. And when Allen left Ford, they probably needed somebody to come in and be a little bit more responsive. You know, it's not like there's a new sheriff in town.
Mhm.
And I don't know. It seems to me like they kind of reinvented another way to do business again, because a lot of what Allen did at Ford didn't stick. That was not Allen's problem. But I think that it's quite possible you need to ask yourself, do we want somebody to come in and recreate things? Do we want somebody to come in and maintain things? And this can be, to me, one of the many things that we should consider in hiring, especially among leaders. Because to take a really, really disruptive leader and ask them to avoid disrupting it most of the time is probably pretty unpleasant.
Well, and I love that caveat at the end, Pat, which is especially for leaders, because if you're the leader, you get permission to kind of live into in some ways, it's like if you're a team individual contributor, if Matt all of a sudden is unmuting himself all the time, and like, which we would love you to do more, Matt. But if you're an individual contributor, people can be like, hey, it's not time to disrupt, and kind of slap some hands there. But if you're the leader, it can create some real turbulence for the organization, for the team, because you kind of have the formal authority to do what you want. So being that level of self-aware and realizing, what is it that the company needs right now, what my team needs from me, and am I naturally wired in my geniuses to be responsive or disruptive in this season, is a really, really good place to avoid some misery.
Boy, I just was thinking about this. Hiring somebody who has really strong geniuses and putting them in a job where they're not supposed to use them is actually extraordinarily dangerous. Because as you said, why would you bring somebody in? Why would you bring Michael Jordan into your team and saying, hey, we don't want you to dunk the ball and go to the basket and play good defense. We're really looking for somebody who's just going to rebound. Mm-hmm. It would be better to have an average rebounder on your team than somebody who has geniuses that you're constantly trying to corral. I think especially when it comes to responsive and disruptive, or maybe not especially, but certainly in regard to that, that is something to really consider. And maybe what we should consider is just wrapping this up, because I think that's pretty much what we want to say.
Hey, before we wrap up, I know Matt has got an announcement to make.
Don't unmute yourself, Matt. No, I'm just kidding.
So last episode, at the end of the episode, we said that we would send some swag to anyone to two people who review the podcast and share stories about how the Working Genius has worked within their family, or what they've come to realize in their personal life or anything outside of work. And so we got two reviews here that we loved. The first is from Chattanooga Listens, also known as Becky. She's a GT. And the title is, "Oh, I just go nuts at Christmas." So, but basically the review was just why she believes that the Working Genius model has had such a fast adoption. And she talks about her father, who was a galvanizer extraordinaire, loved Christmas, wondering how to make family memories better. And she said her mother was Mrs. Enablement and would help fulfill his genius of wonder. So they worked well together.
It's like Santa Claus and Mrs. Claus.
Yeah. And she talked about how Christmas matters, family gatherings matter, and how you don't have to be the host to galvanize your family around the idea of genuinely wanting to know people and be known. That was just,
I loved it. And she said this stuff applies so much outside of work as well as in work, which is great.
Yeah, that's awesome.
So Becky, we don't have your contact information or your address or anything. So if you're listening to this, please email podcast@tablegroup.com, and we'd love to send you some sort of Working Genius swag.
Matt, we could probably just FedEx something to Chattanooga, and they'd
yeah,
know
it would probably find its way to her, I'm sure, yeah. So the second one that we chose was from Mater Pie's mom, and I thought that was a funny username. I looked it up, and apparently that means tomato pie. So I guess pizza. So Pizza Mom says, mind blowing. And she said she's a junkie when it comes to leadership, self-awareness, team building. She said the Working Genius is easy to understand. And she echoed a version of a story that we've told a couple different times with people who have wrote in, which is her husband has the gift of discernment. And so now she realizes that he doesn't actually hate all her ideas and isn't trying to crush her dreams.
What a great realization. That's great.
Yeah. And so both of these emails were just overwhelmingly kind and appreciative. And we want to send you guys some swag. So Mater Pie's mom and Chattanooga Listens, aka Becky, please email podcast@tablegroup.com and identify yourself so we can send you some cool stuff.
Matt, do you realize some random person could write in and say, I'm Mater Pie's mom, and we would not know?
I just sent you an email like I'm Becky because I want one more of these Working Genius quarter zips. They're great.
Yeah, I did realize that, and I'll just do some background checks. I'll make sure. I'll ask if they like. I'll ask them what their favorite pizza is, I guess.
Yeah, send a picture of yourself with today's newspaper, right, Matt?
And delete your review.
Very good. Well, thank you to both of those people and everybody else. We got quite a few wonderful comments, and we love to receive those. So, all right. Thank you, Matt. Thanks, everybody. We'll talk to you next time on the Working Genius podcast. God bless.